Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bible by the Week. We are on week 15, which means that we got to read the book of Ruth and also the first 20 chapters of First Samuel. And along with it, we're starting to sprinkle in some Psalms. This week, it was Psalm 11 and 59 attributed to David. And they're kind of sprinkled in here because the Psalms are reflective of the situation. We had one from Moses at the end of his life. We're going to have some Psalms sprinkled in that are attributed to David that reflect the conditions of his life. We'll have some down the road that come later on, the worship life of Israel when we get into that and so on. So that's why these Psalms are kind of scattered throughout there. The historical context can help you to make sense of what was going on that these Psalms are reflecting on. So this week, as I said, we start with the book of Ruth, which is a famous story. There's a famine in Bethlehem, and so a guy named Elimelech and his wife Naomi moved to Moab. Now, you might remember that Moab was settled by the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, and there was kind of a sordid story of Lot and his daughters being driven out of Sodom, and when Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. And so the Moabites are not necessarily friendly kinsmen of the Israelites. But they go to Moab because apparently there's food and or work there. And their sons, because they stay there for an extended time, marry two women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. Interestingly enough, if you're wondering where Oprah got her name, it was a misspelling of Orpah from the Bible. Uh, all three of the men, Elimelech and his two sons, die there in Moab. And Naomi prepares to return to Bethlehem. That is his wife. She's going to go to her ancestral home. There's nothing left for her in Moab. And her two daughter-in-laws go along with her. But she says, "What? I'm too old to have more sons for you. You need to marry." As you know, in ancient cultures, there was no way really for women to make it on their own other than prostitution. Generally, if they were widowed, especially, and they had no children, as was the case, they needed to find someone to marry them and give them children so that they could develop a household. That was the basic unit of industry. And so Orpah agrees and goes back to Moab, but Ruth says no, famously, where you will go, I will go, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. So she really makes a implicit commitment to the God of Israel. So then Naomi says, okay, then. And they go to Bethlehem. Now, while they're in Bethlehem, Ruth is making a living by gleaning when they arrive there for harvest. Gleaning is the practice, of course, of picking up the crops that haven't been harvested in the first sweep through. They weren't ripe yet, or they were left, they fell, and she's allowed to do this under Israel's laws. This is part of how the poor receive some kind of benefit. And she meets a guy named Boaz who's very nice to her. He invites her to stay for dinner, and because he's heard about Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. Now, they he stays for dinner, and he's a close relative, and he's a potential redeemer. This was a position in the ancient world where if someone, a woman, her husband had died and she didn't have children, as I said, then a close kinsman could marry her and could receive the property. The reason it had to be a close kinsman of her husband is because they wanted the property to stay in the family. Remember, that was an important part of Israelite law and culture to prevent some people from getting very rich while others get very poor. So he lets her know that he is a kinsman redeemer, but there's someone closer in line who could marry her. Um, so he finally finds that kinsman redeemer. They have a meeting in the town gate, which is where public business is transacted. And the kinsman redeemer, the other one, realizes that it could endanger his property if he marries Ruth and inherits her husband's property. So Boaz agrees to marry her. You would say they shake on it. Actually, they exchange sandals. That's how they did it. And And Boaz marries Ruth, and they have children. She actually becomes the grandmother of King David, which is part of why this book is in the Bible. It's not just a great example of a godly woman who is a foreigner and, in fact, an enemy of Israel, and yet gets incorporated into Israel, but she's the grandmother, great grandmother of King David. A little more on that later, but that makes her an ancestor of Jesus, by the way. So she's in Jesus' uh, genealogy. That brings us to First Samuel, which starts with a guy named Elkanah who has a wife named Hannah. And Hannah is a godly woman, but she's barren. She has no children. This is a big problem throughout the Bible, as you know. Um, every year they go to the temple in Jerusalem. So at this point, it would be the tabernacle in Jerusalem. And Hannah prays for a child, and the priest Eli sees her and he blesses her. And she vows that if she has a child, if she's given a son, she will devote him to the Lord. So she has a child, names him Samuel. And when he's weaned at about 3 years old, they didn't have formula or anything, but he was, weaned and potty trained and so on. He's given to the priests to serve in the temple. And that way, Hannah fulfills her vow, but she can come visit him, she can support him, provide clothes for him, and so on. And she offers a song of praise to God, showing her piety. And it really is a prediction of the coming king and Messiah that's in her song to God. Now, Eli, the priest who is raising Samuel at the temple, has two delinquent sons who are also priests, and yet they are not devoted to God. And Eli, like some of the other fathers in the scripture, is not an attentive or tough enough father. And because they have been stealing offerings from God and basically ripping people off through their status as priests, they should be removed, but Eli doesn't do that. He just warns them. And a prophet warns Eli that because of this, because he's showing a lack of respect for God by not punishing his sons, that they are going to die. But a faithful priest will be raised up. And initially, this refers to Samuel, eventually Zadok, which means righteousness, the high priesthood, and ultimately Jesus would be the faithful priest of God. And then we have this famous story where one night when Samuel is sleeping in the temple because they have to keep the oil burning all night, he hears what he thinks is Eli calling to him, and he says, "Here I am. What do you want?" And Eli says, "I didn't call for you." And he says, "Go back to sleep." And it happens again, and he says, "Here I am." And Eli said, "I didn't call you." And finally, the third time, Eli says, "The Lord must be talking to you." So if that happens again, say, "Speak, O Lord, your servant listens," famously. And that's what Samuel the boy does. And he is given bad news for Eli that he is going to be punished by the Lord. He's going to be judged, but Samuel is told that Samuel, is going to be great in the eyes of the Lord. So we move on a little bit. Israel, it has brought out the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle as a secret weapon against the Philistines. But Israel's defeated and the Ark is captured by the Philistines, and Eli's two sons die in that battle. They've accompanied the Ark, misusing the Ark as a magic charm. And when Eli hears about this, hears about not just the death of his sons, but that the ark has been captured, he falls back in his chair. He's apparently got a weight problem, and he breaks his neck and dies, as was prophesied. Now, interestingly enough, the Philistines bring the ark of the Lord into the temple of their god, Dagon, this false god. And when they get up the next morning, Dagon has fallen face down, facing towards the ark. And so they push him back up. The next night, Dagon, overnight, his hands and his head fall off. So the Philistines say, "We can't keep this ark here. It's dangerous." They want to get rid of it. After 7 months, they figure out a way to return the ark because they are afraid of the Lord. But 70 of the Israelites themselves are killed for their irreverence in returning the ark the way that they do. Samuel calls the people to repentance. He's now grown up and become a priest and a powerful prophet in his own right. He's become a judge and an interceder, meaning people bring their problems to him. And after defeating the Israelites, he's called them to repentance. They raise up an Ebenezer. Again, what does Ebenezer mean? It doesn't mean a Scrooge. It means a stone of remembrance, a reminder, a monument, you might say. Um, and Israel demands a king so that they can have one like the people around them. Remember, this was the big lesson out of Judges. There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what they saw fit. Um, and so, Samuel asks the Lord about this, and God says, don't take it personally. They've been asking for this for a long time. So through Samuel, he warns the people what it's going to mean to have a king. It's going to mean taxes. It's going to be conscription for the military. It's going to mean that the king can make, random laws, and you're really at the mercy to whether the king has good judgment or not. So he's going to give them what they asked for, but they might not like what they ask for. Um, Still, they persist. God relents. And there's this tall, handsome guy named Saul who seeks out Samuel because he's a seer, that is a prophet, and he has lost some donkeys that are valuable animals. And God tells Samuel to anoint Saul to be prince. Interestingly enough, to restrain my people. Right? Saul is from the humble tribe of Benjamin, and he's honored by this. And it's a reflection on Saul's character that he gives him a sign that the Lord is with him, and the Spirit of God enters Saul as it's predicted. And so Saul is chosen by the people of Israel as their leader, as their king. But when he's chosen, well, when they're going about this, he's actually hiding in the luggage. Why? Because he's actually afraid. By himself, he doesn't have the confidence to do this. It's only the Spirit of the Lord that makes him a good and worthy king, which I think is a great lesson. But he's chosen by Lot to be king. And this evil king Nahash, the Ammonite, rises up against them, and he besieges one of the cities in Israel, Jabesh Gilead, and he warns them that he's going to conquer them, and he's going to gouge out the right eye of every person to humiliate them, not just to out of cruelty. And when Saul hears about it, this cruelty and this lack of respect for Israel and for Israel's God, of course, the Spirit of the Lord drives him to be the leader of the army. And they go ahead and in righteous anger, they destroy the Ammonite army. And so at Gilgal, Saul is officially made king before the Lord. And Samuel convicts the Israelites of adding the call for a king to the other ways they've been unfaithful to God. Because remember, this wasn't God's idea that they would have a king. They were supposed to be ruled as a theocracy. It just wouldn't work for them, partly because the priests were themselves corrupt, like Eli's sons, and partly because they just needed a stronger hand because they weren't actually following the law of Moses. That's kind of what's behind a lot of this. They're not following God's laws. They need a king as an enforcer. So Samuel assures them that the Lord won't forsake them, even though they're doing this thing, as long as they don't forsake the Lord. Well, we'll see how that goes. And as long as their king doesn't forsake the law, more to the point. Now, Saul has a son named Jonathan, who seems to be a good guy, a godly guy. Could, if it had been God's will, maybe he would have been the next king. But he attacks a Philistine garrison. So the Philistines invade Israel. Saul musters the Israelites as an army. But when Samuel hasn't joined them, and it's a week later and the troops are starting to scatter, Saul gets nervous. He's not willing to trust God by himself. And so he takes it upon himself to burn an offering to God rather than the priests doing it as commanded in God's law. When Samuel arrives, he rebukes Saul, predicts that a man after God's own heart is going to replace Saul. And I should mention that the Israelites are poorly equipped to go, to war. And part of this is it's pretty well known by archaeology outside the Bible that Israel didn't have the iron and copper resources to make swords. It was early Bronze Age we would say. And the Philistines do, and they're withholding, this resource. They have kind of a monopoly on swords. And so this makes it hard. Only a few people in Israel would have a sword. So Jonathan and his squire attack the Philistines. They cross the lines. They kill 20 men just between the two of them in this pass. Saul hasn't learned anything from the story of Eli, calls for the ark, but doesn't wait for God's directive on how to wage war. So what he does is he decrees a fast. Everybody needs to fast and not eat or drink until we kill all these Philistines. Well, Jonathan hasn't heard this. He's out in the field fighting, and so he finds some honeycomb. He's, growing faint with hunger, so he eats some of this honeycomb. And so Saul has, said anybody who does this is going to die. It's his son, Jonathan, this rash vow. But the troops, the people intercede for Jonathan, and they redeem him or ransom him. Meanwhile, the Philistines get away. Again, Saul is not seeking the Lord's will. He's not seeking first the kingdom of God. He's doing things under his own impulses, and it's not turning out well. So, sent to punish the Amalekites by God, Saul disobeys God. Again, he spares the king of the Amalekites, and he spares their livestock that he was told that he should kill. He claims when Samuel shows up that he's gonna sacrifice them. Now, I just want to interrupt here. This is not, maybe it's going to sound like a commercial, but there happens to be a series that just came out on Amazon Prime called The House of David that starts with this scene with Samuel confronting Saul. And I have to say, I've only seen the first couple episodes, but it's actually very good. It really gives you a sense of why the Amalekite king should have been killed, because he was really a cult and this terrible figure, and how Saul's ego had gotten the best of him. And it also points out something that I had to look up, and that is in this series, you'll remember that when later on, if you've read through, you know that David is anointed the next king, but his father, Jesse, doesn't even call him in from the field. And this series makes a point of David being not kind of an outcast among his own people because his mother was an outcast. And, that made me say, well, I've never heard of this, David being an outcast. Well, it turns out there's a rabbinic tradition that David was an outcast. Why? Because his grandmother, Ruth, was a Moabitess. And so this series posits that Jesse actually had two wives, and the other sons were from his first wife. His second wife, whom he loved, was David's mother, and they actually have the rabbinic name for David's mother. It's not in the Bible, but that she was a bit of an outcast because she had Moabite blood in her. Therefore, David was an outcast. I don't know that the Bible neither supports this. It doesn't really support this. It doesn't really refute this. It could well be that this is the case because the Israelites weren't supposed to intermarry with the Moabites to several generations. But it does make a lot of sense why David was out in the field, why he wasn't respected the way that his brothers were. Anyway, it's fiction. It tries to fill in the gaps, but it's biblical fiction, and it gives you a good flavor. I think it was inspired not just by the Bible, but maybe Game of Thrones or something like that. But I would just encourage you. It'll make you think a lot about this story of David and the story of Saul and of Samuel confronting Saul. So anyway, getting back to our story in the Bible, Saul spares these things, and Samuel ends up killing the Amalekite king. Saul says that he's going to sacrifice these animals. That's why he spared them. And Saul says to obey is better than sacrifice. As you've rejected the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And this triggers some mental illness, an evil spirit on the part of Saul, which again, this series does a good job of presenting. And he's tormented by this evil spirit. David is known as a skilled musician. Saul hires David to come in as a music therapist. He likes him so much that David becomes his squire. And then we come to this famous story about the Goliath, the giant Philistine champion who taunts Israel. Champion is someone who fights at the forefront of the army and can even represent the army at times. And he taunts Israel, but David famously defeats him with his slingshot in the name of the Lord. By the way, this series on TV on Amazon also has the backstory of David killing a lion before this all happens. It's quite interesting. And David is beloved by Jonathan, Saul's son, and he commands an army division. And Saul gets jealous when he's unfavorably compared. People say, well, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And you can imagine that gets under Saul's skin. But he can't quite kill David. He tries. He humiliates him by he had promised his daughter Merab in marriage. He withdraws her hand, but then he gives another daughter, Michal, to David in order to ensnare him. He says, "You can have my daughter's hand, but it'll cost you." What's the cost? The bride price? 100 Philistine foreskins. And I'm sure Michael's rolling her eyes, going, "Oh, great, Dad! Thanks a lot. Nice dowry." Um, but anyway, David does fulfill that, so he's legally entitled to marry the daughter of the king. Why is this an issue? Well, Saul did this because he wanted to kill David or have David killed. David, of course, is motivated to do this. Forget about love, because he now is married to a daughter of the king, and it really advances his claim. So, um, David is continually successful, making Saul afraid, but Jonathan and Michal also, they both work to save David from Saul's treachery. And the spirit of prophecy convicts Saul. He knows that God has predicted this is what's going to happen. Jonathan tries to mediate with Saul. That doesn't happen. So he sends him away. There's this famous scene where they're out in a field, and Saul, Jonathan has arranged a sign because David needs to know what Saul's disposition is towards him. And Jonathan arranges a sign. They have a private meeting. He tells David, "Look, you got to run with your life because my father really is trying to kill you." Now, the two Psalms that get thrown in here, Psalm 11 is one in which David declares that the Lord is his refuge. And this, of course, will be the case throughout his life, starting with his being chased down by Saul. And then Psalm 59 is one in which David explicitly asks for deliverance from assassins that are dogging him. Play on words, he says that they're like dogs. And so that's why these play in, because this is the beginning of David being pursued by assassins, those that are commissioned by King Saul, even though David has served him extremely well. That's the end of our readings for this week. We'll pick up this coming week with the story of how that plays out between David and Saul. I hope you enjoy the readings, and the Lord